There it was, stuck to the mailbox like a scarlet letter, a formal notice from the HOA. Sarah pulled it free, her brow furrowing. It wasn't the usual reminder about trash cans or lawn length. This one had a number attached. A big number. $20,000. For having a pontoon boat. She hadn't even put the boat in the water yet. It was just parked discreetly on a trailer behind her house, barely visible from the street, fully compliant with setback rules. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe homeowners should have rights, not be bullied by power-hungry neighbors, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Sarah had bought her modest home in Osprey Cove specifically because of the proximity to the lake and the promise of a peaceful, community-oriented neighborhood. She was new to the area, a project manager who valued quiet weekends and the thought of finally having her own place with lake access. She'd carefully reviewed the HOA covenants before closing, noting standard restrictions about noise, property maintenance, and architectural changes. There was a section on boats, primarily concerning parking large vessels in driveways or on the street, which she planned to avoid by keeping her pontoon on her property and using the community launch. She'd even introduced herself to a few neighbors, attended the last, somewhat dull, HOA meeting, and made an effort to keep her yard immaculate. She wanted to be a good neighbor, contribute to the community, and enjoy her little slice of lakeside living. But what she discovered next would force her to choose between keeping the peace and defending her property rights. Sarah loved the idea of living near the water. Her job was demanding, and the thought of unwinding on her pontoon boat, drifting on the lake, had been a significant factor in choosing Osprey Cove. The house itself was simple but perfect for her, a small yard, a place to park her boat trailer out of sight, and a short walk to the community dock and boat ramp. She envisioned quiet evenings, maybe inviting a neighbor or two over for a casual get-together. She had invested carefully, seeing the property as a long-term home, a place of stability and peace. The HOA board, however, was dominated by a woman named Barbara Babs Jenkins, a retiree with an excess of time and a seemingly insatiable need for control. Babs styled herself as the neighborhood's benevolent matriarch, but her iron grip on the HOA was a quiet source of tension for many. Rules seemed to be interpreted, and sometimes invented, on the fly, often targeting perceived slights or personal vendettas rather than genuine covenant violations. Most residents grumbled privately but complied, unwilling to rock the boat. It was easier to trim the azaleas exactly 2 inches shorter or paint the mailbox the approved shade of beige than to face Babs's passive-aggressive critiques and official-looking notices. Sarah had briefly met Babs at that first HOA meeting. Babs, a woman with meticulously styled hair and a severe floral blouse, had given her a once-over that felt more like an inspection than a welcome. She'd asked pointed questions about Sarah's job, implying she wouldn't be around much to maintain her property, and whether she understood the importance of maintaining community standards. Sarah had smiled, assured her she was committed to being a good homeowner, and made a mental note to ensure her lawn was always perfectly edged. She wanted zero conflict. The early signs of Babs's entitlement were subtle. A pointed email to the neighborhood list about unapproved yard ornaments the day after Sarah put out a small garden gnome. A comment about the height of Sarah's grass being borderline, despite it clearly being below the stated maximum in the covenants. They were tiny pricks, easily dismissed, but in retrospect, they were reconnaissance. Babs was establishing her watch. One afternoon, while Sarah was organizing her garage, she overheard Babs talking loudly on her phone just down the street. "Yes, the new one on Meadow Lane," Babs said, her voice carrying in the quiet neighborhood. "She has a boat. A pontoon. Just sitting there. It's enormous, a real eyesore. I don't care if it's technically behind the house. Its trailer is visible from Brenda's driveway. And we need to address lake usage. People think just because they live here they can use the community dock whenever they please. Some limits need to be established. Perhaps a reservation system. Or a fee for anything larger than a kayak." Sarah froze, listening. Babs's focus wasn't just on maintaining standards. It was about controlling access and imposing her will. The idea of her lake, her community dock, was clear in her tone. The fine arrived 2 days later. $20,000. The notice cited a non-existent rule about the size and type of boat allowed to be stored on private property, vaguely referenced aesthetic impact, and demanded payment within 30 days or face escalating fines and a lien. Sarah stared at the paper, her initial shock giving way to a knot of cold frustration in her stomach. $20,000? For a boat that wasn't even in the water? legally parked on her own property? This wasn't about community standards. This was an abuse of power, a blatant attempt at intimidation based on a subjective opinion and a fabricated rule. Her peaceful move, her investment, her desire for a quiet life, suddenly felt threatened. Her first reaction was disbelief. Surely, this was a mistake. She pulled out her copy of the HOA covenants. She read the section on vehicles and boats multiple times. It specified that boats, trailers, and RVs could not be parked in driveways or on the street for extended periods but could be stored on the property if screened or located behind the main dwelling, provided they were in good repair and registered. Her pontoon met all those criteria. There was nothing about type, size limits beyond what fit on the property, or a $20,000 fine for a first violation. The fine schedule listed minor fines, $50 to $100, for common violations, escalating slowly. A $20,000 fine was unprecedented, extortionate. She decided to try the direct approach first. She called the number listed on the notice, which connected her to the property management company the HOA used. The representative was polite but firm. "Yes, Ms. Peterson, we received the violation report from the Osprey Cove Board. It pertains to your pontoon boat. But there's no rule against storing a pontoon boat on my property," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've read the covenants. It only says they can't be in the driveway or street. The board determined the boat constitutes a significant aesthetic detraction and is not in harmony with community standards," the representative recited, sounding bored. "The fine is effective immediately. But what specific rule is it violating? And where did $20,000 come from? The fine schedule doesn't list anything close to that." "That was a board decision," the representative said, their tone hardening slightly. "Appeals must be submitted in writing to the board within 15 days. So the board can just invent rules and fines?" Sarah asked, the frustration bubbling up. "I just processed the notices, Ms. Peterson," the rep replied, a clear signal the conversation was over. Hanging up, Sarah felt a chill. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, and it reeked of Babs Jenkins. The mention of aesthetic detraction and community standards, Babs's favorite vague justifications. She knew instantly this was Babs flexing her power, targeting the new homeowner who dared to bring something unsightly, in Babs's opinion, into her neighborhood. The sheer audacity of the $20,000 figure felt personal, designed to overwhelm and force immediate compliance, likely by selling the boat or moving out. Sarah didn't sleep well that night. The injustice of it gnawed at her. She had saved and planned for this home, this life. To have it immediately threatened by an arbitrary, baseless fine based on one person's whim felt fundamentally wrong. But she wasn't going to be run over. The initial fear began to solidify into resolve. They had picked the wrong person to bully. The next day, Sarah began documenting everything. She took multiple photos of the pontoon boat from every angle, showing its clean condition and its placement behind the house, barely visible from the street, certainly not the enormous eyesore Babs described. She scanned the violation notice. She printed out the relevant pages of the HOA covenants regarding vehicles and fines. She started a detailed log, date and time of receiving the notice, the phone call with the property management company, the overheard conversation with Babs. She drafted a calm, formal letter to the HOA board appealing the fine, referencing the specific covenant sections that showed no rule violation regarding the boat storage and questioning the legality of the arbitrary $20,000 fine, which was not listed in the published fine schedule. She sent it via certified mail, keeping a copy and the receipt. This was step one, methodical, procedural, building her case. The abuse escalated swiftly after she submitted her appeal. Sarah started receiving anonymous notes in her mailbox complaining about the boat. One neighbor, Brenda, Babs's apparent confidant from the phone call, pointedly parked her car in a way that seemed intended to obstruct the view of Sarah's property, but also slightly blocked the sidewalk. The subtle pressure was mounting. Then came the follow-up from the HOA. Not a response to her appeal, but another notice. This one cited failure to remedy previous violation and added a daily fine of $100, retroactive to the date of the first notice, already adding several $100s. The notice reiterated the $20,000 initial assessment. This was a clear attempt to panic her, to make the financial threat immediate and compounding. They weren't even acknowledging her appeal, they were just doubling down. Sarah knew she needed professional help. This was no longer a simple neighborhood disagreement. It was a legal threat involving a substantial amount of money and her property rights. She researched lawyers specializing in real estate and HOA law in her state. She found one with good reviews who offered a free initial consultation. During the consultation, she laid out everything: the covenants, the notices, the timeline, the overheard conversation, the photos. The lawyer, Ms. Evans, listened patiently, reviewing the documents. "Okay, Ms. Peterson," she said, leaning back in her chair. "A $20,000 fine for a first-time boat storage violation that isn't even prohibited by the covenants and isn't on the published fine schedule? This is aggressive and highly questionable legally." Ms. Evans explained HOA powers and limitations. HOAs derive their power from the recorded covenants in state law. They must follow due process for violations and fines. Fines must be reasonable and typically correspond to a published schedule accessible to homeowners. Inventing a $20,000 fine out of thin air for an activity not explicitly prohibited was almost certainly outside the scope of their authority and a potential violation of state HOA laws regarding fair enforcement and due process. This looks less like enforcing covenants and more like targeted harassment and financial intimidation, Ms. Evans concluded, especially with the swift follow-up notice and retroactive daily fines without addressing your appeal. Ms. Evans advised Sarah to continue documenting everything. Get security cameras, especially facing her driveway and the street near her mailbox. Note every interaction, every unusual event. She explained the formal legal steps: a demand letter from her attorney to the HOA challenging the fines and demanding proof of the violated rule and legal basis for the fine amount, followed potentially by mediation or a lawsuit if the HOA didn't back down. She also mentioned checking the HOA's internal procedures. Were board meetings properly noticed? Were minutes kept? Were votes recorded? Often, overzealous boards cut corners on procedure, which could invalidate their actions. Empowered by the legal consultation, Sarah installed a Ring doorbell camera and a second camera covering her driveway and the side of the house where the boat was. She felt a small measure of security knowing there was now an objective witness. She continued her detailed log, noting Brenda's parking antics and any other unusual neighborhood activity. The pressure from Babs and the board intensified. At the community mailbox cluster, Babs intercepted Sarah. "Miss Peterson," Babs said, her voice dripping with false concern, Brenda hovering nearby. "We were so hoping you'd resolve the boat situation quickly. It's really become quite the topic of conversation. Some residents are finding it quite disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic, you see. We truly value maintaining property values and a certain caliber of environment here." Babs gestured vaguely towards Sarah's house. "That fine is simply intended to encourage swift compliance. It's for the good of the community, dear." This was the second mandated micro-cameo, the direct confrontation revealing the true intent. Babs wasn't hiding the intimidation anymore, wrapping it in the language of community welfare. "Ms. Jenkins," Sarah replied calmly, meeting Babs's gaze directly for the first time. "As you know, I have filed a formal appeal of that fine, based on the fact that my boat is parked in compliance with the published covenants, and the fine amount is not only unsupported by any rule but is also extortionate and not listed in the fine schedule. I have retained legal counsel. All further communication regarding this matter should go through my attorney." Sarah handed Babs a business card for Ms. Evans. Babs's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the mention of a lawyer and the unexpected resolve. Brenda gasped softly. "Legal counsel? For an HOA matter? That seems extreme." Babs sputtered, recovering quickly. "We're just trying to uphold the rules everyone agreed to." "I agree to uphold the rules that are actually written in the covenants and enforced fairly," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but firm. "A $20,000 fine for a legally parked boat is not fair, nor is it supported by the covenants. My attorney will be in touch." Turning, Sarah walked away, leaving a momentarily stunned Babs and Brenda standing by the mailboxes. The encounter, though brief, marked a turning point. Sarah had publicly signaled she would not be easily intimidated and was prepared to fight. This likely infuriated Babs, but it also put her on notice. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with quiet determination. The time for trying to be nice was over. It was time to fight strategically. Sarah dove deeper into the HOA's operations. Ms. Evans had suggested requesting copies of recent board meeting minutes, financial records related to fines collected, and the official, filed copy of the covenants and rules with the county. This was where the smoking gun might be hidden. What Sarah found confirmed her suspicions of procedural sloppiness and potential malfeasance. The meeting minutes were sparse and often incomplete, particularly regarding discussions about rules enforcement or fines. There was no record in the minutes of a board meeting where a rule about pontoon boats or a $20,000 fine structure was proposed, discussed, or voted upon. The financial records showed very few fines collected in the past, mostly small amounts for late dues, nothing remotely close to $20,000. It appeared the $20,000 fine was entirely off-book, decided unilaterally by Babs or a small, unrecorded clique, and then rubber-stamped by the property management company without proper procedural basis. The most damning discovery came from reviewing the officially filed covenants at the county clerk's office. The copy the HOA provided to residents was slightly different from the one on file. A subtle addition had been made regarding oversized recreational vehicles, including specific boat types like pontoons, prohibiting their storage on individual lots. This wasn't in the original filed document Sarah had received during her home purchase process. Someone had altered the digital version of the covenants distributed to residents without properly amending and filing the changes with the county. That made the new rule unenforceable. Armed with this definitive proof, the fabricated rule and the lack of procedural basis for the fine in the minutes, Sarah had the legal weapon she needed. Ms. Evans was confident. "This changes everything," she told Sarah. "The fine is invalid on multiple grounds. It's based on an unenforceable, improperly adopted rule. The amount is arbitrary, punitive, and not listed in the bylaws or a valid fine schedule. And they failed to follow due process in addressing your appeal before adding daily fines. We have them." Sarah and Ms. Evans strategized. The goal wasn't just to get the fine overturned. It was to expose the abuse of power and ensure it didn't happen again. A lawsuit was an option, but expensive and potentially lengthy. Ms. Evans suggested starting with a strongly worded demand letter detailing the specific legal and procedural violations, backed by the evidence Sarah had gathered, including the altered covenants and lack of board approval in the minutes. They would send it certified mail to the board and the property management company. Simultaneously, Sarah would share her findings discreetly with a few trusted neighbors who had also expressed frustration with Babs's control. Community pressure could be a powerful tool. Babs, meanwhile, seemed utterly convinced of her impending victory. She likely saw Sarah's request for communication through her attorney as a sign of weakness, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. She continued her subtle and not-so-subtle campaign, complaining about the boat issue at community gatherings, implying Sarah was being difficult and selfish. She was overconfident, failing to grasp the depth of Sarah's quiet investigation and the solid legal ground she now stood on. Babs made a crucial mistake. She believed her perceived authority was absolute and unchecked. The legal action phase began with the delivery of Ms. Evans's demand letter. It was direct and damning, citing the specific sections of state law and the HOA's own, original, filed covenants that the board's actions had violated. It detailed the lack of procedural basis for the fine, the arbitrary amount, and presented the evidence of the altered covenants. The letter demanded the immediate and permanent rescission of the $20,000 fine and all associated daily penalties, a written apology, and a commitment from the board to adhere strictly to the filed covenants and proper procedures in the future. It concluded by stating that if these demands were not met within 10 days, Sarah would pursue legal action, including seeking recovery of her legal fees from the HOA. The reaction was swift and panicked. The property management company, upon receiving the letter and reviewing the evidence, especially the altered covenants, immediately distanced itself from the board's decision, stating they acted solely on the board's directive and were reviewing their contract with Osprey Cove HOA given the apparent legal irregularities. Babs and the rest of the board received the letter via certified mail. Sarah heard later through the neighborhood grapevine that there was an emergency, unannounced, and therefore procedurally invalid, board meeting that evening. The security camera footage confirmed unusual activity at the board president's house where meetings were sometimes held. Babs, cornered, tried one last desperation tactic. She left a voicemail for Sarah. Her tone fluctuated between appeasement, "Maybe we can discuss a reduced fine," and veiled threat, "Legal action is so disruptive. It could reflect poorly on everyone, property values." She didn't mention the altered covenants or the procedural issues. She just wanted the legal threat to go away. Sarah did not return the call. The truth began to spread. The neighbors Sarah had confided in shared the gist of the legal letter and the evidence of the fabricated rule and improper fine. Whispers turned into open discussions at mailboxes and over fences. Other residents, emboldened by Sarah's stand, started asking questions about other questionable rules or fines they had received. The collective frustration with Babs's heavy-handed rule finally had a focal point and solid evidence to back it up. Facing a potential lawsuit they knew they would lose, and with the property management company potentially pulling out, the board crumbled. Not wanting their personal assets potentially exposed by facilitating Babs's legally dubious actions, the other board members, who had mostly deferred to Babs, effectively mutinied. They held a properly noticed, though tense, emergency meeting. At the climax, the community came together. Residents attended the emergency meeting, demanding answers. Sarah was there, quiet and composed, with Ms. Evans by her side. Babs attempted to bluff, claiming Sarah's boat was a unique problem requiring unique measures, trying to invoke vague community standards again. But when pressed for the specific rule and the vote authorizing the fine, she faltered. Ms. Evans calmly presented the evidence of the altered covenants and the lack of board authorization in the minutes. The air went out of Babs's sails. The other board members, pale and nervous, admitted that the fine and the supposed rule had not followed proper procedure and had not been formally voted on according to the filed covenants. Under pressure from Ms. Evans and the assembled, now outraged homeowners, the board voted unanimously, with a visibly fuming Babs abstaining, to immediately rescind the $20,000 fine and all associated daily penalties, declare the pontoon boat rule null and void due to improper adoption, and issue a written apology to Sarah. Furthermore, sensing the mood of the community, 2 board members resigned on the spot, and a petition was immediately circulated to call for a special election to remove Babs Jenkins from her position as president and from the board entirely. In the immediate aftermath, Sarah walked back to her quiet house. The threatening notices were invalid paper now. The $20,000 fine, the $100 daily penalties, the threats, all gone. She stood by her pontoon boat, untouched behind the house, a symbol of her successful fight. The legal victory was confirmed quickly. The HOA sent the required letter rescinding the fines. The petition to remove Babs garnered more than enough signatures, forcing a special community meeting. Faced with overwhelming opposition and the potential for further legal scrutiny, Babs Jenkins resigned from the board before the removal vote could take place. Babs faced consequences, public humiliation, the loss of her cherished control over the HOA, and the quiet shunning by many neighbors who had seen her abuse of power firsthand. Her attempts to maintain influence failed as new, more transparent board members were elected. Sarah's life in Osprey Cove settled into a new rhythm. Her property was now clearly her protected space, no longer subject to arbitrary rules or baseless threats. She had established clear boundaries. She would follow the actual rules, but she would not tolerate bullying or overreach. The community felt different, lighter, freed from Babs's oppressive control. Sitting on her back porch, looking towards the lake, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace mixed with quiet satisfaction. She hadn't wanted a fight, but when pushed, she had stood her ground, methodically gathered her strength, and used reason and the law to prevail. Her hard-won wisdom was a quiet shield now. Standing up to a bully wasn't about matching their aggression. It was about knowing your rights, gathering your evidence, and acting with calm, strategic resolve. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more stories about standing up to HOA bullies.